he's also got like a Three Sisters sort of thing because there's corn. I saw squash. Yeah, yeah. So I'd like to begin by welcoming a visitor to our territory. So this is Ron Bull, and so his family has been harvesting since time immemorial. They have been a central figure within the landscape, and so Ron has spent a lot of time within the food service industry, and so that he's brought that traditional knowledge about food into that work, and so now he is a director within Indigenous education within Otago Polytechnic, and he's also a partner to Humber College with our abroad program, and he's been nothing but a wonderful source of inspiration for us at Humber College, and so I'm really happy that we were able to bring him in because I think you'll agree with me that he has so much knowledge to impart. So, miigwech, and thank you for listening.
Nā te pō ko te ao. Tana ko te ao marama, tana ko te ao tūroa. Tana ko te kore te whiwhia, tana ko te kore te rāwea, tana ko te kore te tāmaua, tana ko te kore te mātua, tana ko māku. A ka moi a māku ki māhoro nui a te ka puta mai ko raki. Ka moi a raki i tuatahi ki puka haoro te pō, ka puta mai ka ao raki mā. Ka moi a raki tuarua ki papatua nuku. Ka puta mai ko tāna mahuta mako, tāna rawa ko paia haka te takata ati hei mauri ora. Ko te mihi tuatahi ki te whenua, ki te wai kei waho, tēnā kōrua. Kei te mihi ki o tini aitua, a haere atu rā, haere atu ki te taha o tō tūpuna o tō ariki hoki. O ia marae, o ia marae, o ia marae. Engari. Te huinga mate ki te huinga mate, te huinga ora ki te huinga ora. Kei te mihi ki te mana whenua, tēnei whenua, Anishinaabe, Mississauga people, tēnā koutou. Ka huri kia koutou katoa. Kia ora koutou. Those first words that I spoke were karakia, were an old prayer that talk about the beginning of time and where everything came from our traditional stories. But I'll talk about that first thing second, and I'll talk about the second thing first. I then acknowledge the lands that we're standing on and the water that provides the sustenance for the land and for the people. I acknowledge the people of this place who have been here and whose footprints have been in this landscape for a long, long time. And I acknowledge those of us who have passed on to the other side, to those tupuna, those ancient people who, even though they're on the other side of the curtain, they're still with us today, and we remember them every single day. But here we are in this world of light, gathered together in this place. In those first words, and actually I'll preface the preface. I'll tell you what, Sage was giving me a hard time about 2 or 3 days ago. She was like, have you written that keynote? And I said, yeah, I've written the keynote. And every time she sees me, yeah, I've written the keynote. I sat down there about 10 minutes ago and I wrote the keynote. So thank you very much for your wise words, Sage. So in those first words, well, that was the preface. No. I feel uncomfortable in a way sharing these stories that I'm going to share with you now. Both uncomfortable and it's very fitting as well, because the stories that I'll share with you are your own stories. They're the stories of the creation of the universe. They're the stories of the creation of the sky, of the earth, of the land, of the trees, of the food, of the people. They're the stories that I've heard over the last 3 days, being told by almost every one of you on these tables. So when I retell these stories to you, I'm not telling you something you don't know. For 25 minutes, I'm going to be telling you the stuff you exactly do know, and you've told me. But I'm going to be reframing those stories into our language, into our way of seeing the world. So those first words that I did start off with, nā te pō ko te ao. In the beginning, I was trying to stay away from the mic. I thought it's whistling at me, I'll stay away from it. So in those first words, nā te pō ko te ao, in the beginning of time, and our stories tell us there was darkness. And after the darkness came light. And the light that came was a light that allowed for light into the universe, but also allowed for knowledge to be shared. There are periods of time of void, of darkness, of void, where nothing existed in the universe, where everything was sorting itself out, where the conversations were being held about which element would have which special power. And the first thing in that story that I told you that existed in the universe was maku. Maku. And that's moisture. In our stories, that moisture, that water, is the thing that allowed everything else to exist. In that story I told you, I said, ka moia maku ki mahuru no ia tia, ka puta mai ko raki. And literally, what I'm saying in there is that maku married the great vastness of heaven. And they had a child, and his name was Raki. And Raki is our word for the sky father. Now, I want you just to sort of remember that phrase, married to and had children with. It's an important phrase when we reflect on that later. In that story as well, I said that Raki, the sky father, in our stories, he was first with Pukoharua te pō, the great winds that blow from the darkness. And they had plenty of children. One of those was called Auraki. And Auraki is a story that I'll loop back on again soon as well. But he's on this side of that genealogy. Then what I said is Raki, the sky father, second in our stories, got together with the earth. And they had plenty of children, including Tāne Mahuta. And Tāne Mahuta is our is our atua, our god of the forests and the forest birds. And there was a relationship between tāne mahuta, the natural environment that we live in, and elements of the earth, and that's where people came from. So within that story, I'm positioning people, all of us, within a story of relationships and connections. We're related to everything that happens within that story. We have a relationship with everything that happens within that story. We are of the environment. We are of the earth. I'll loop back on that as well. But in that story, if you remember, I said in that first relationship that the Sky Father had with the great winds that blow from the darkness, they had a child called Aoraki. And as it happens, Aoraki, when he was up in the sky and he heard that his father was with the earth, he wanted to come down and see what was happening. So he came down in his father's waka, in his father's canoe. And he came and he landed in the water on the earth. And he looked around, him and his brothers, and he said, yeah, this is all right. The old man's doing all right for himself. His new lady looks okay. Now, actually, I was paraphrasing that. I don't know if that's exactly what he did say, but it was sort of along those lines. But when Aoraki and his brothers were ready to go back up to where their father and their mother live up in the heavens, he was supposed to do the karakia, the incantation, to get himself back up there and the canoe back up there. But he got one of the lines wrong in the karakia. And when he got the lines wrong, the winds blew and the seas come up in a great storm. And this canoe that Aoraki was in and his brothers got turned over on its side. And when it got turned over its side, Aoraki and his brothers, they clambered up onto the highest edge, and Aoraki being the tallest, he sat highest. And they stayed there so long, looking up through the heavens, asking that question, Father, why have you forsaken me? Oh no, hold on, that's the other creation story, eh? He looked up into the heavens and waited for his father, but they waited so long that they turned into rock, and their canoe, their waka, their canoe turned into rock. Now when Raki found this out, he wasn't too happy. First of all, his sons had turned to stone, but more importantly, they'd wrecked his waka, his canoe. His bloody kids had taken that waka for a ride again, they've wrecked it. So he sent down what we call tūtiraki whānau. And tūtiraki whānau come down and he shaped the South Island, Te Waka or Aoraki. He shaped that canoe into the shape that it is, particularly with the fields and the flatlands. Then after that, Marukura and Kahukura, they came down from the heavens and they populated the waters with fish and the forest with birds. Now that story there, when we tell that story as people, we're telling the story of the waka, the canoe that we live in. Our people are water people. We sit in the middle of an ocean on a canoe, surrounded all around by the water with the sky above us. So we relate to being together in that waka. And everything that we do when we tell that story reminds us of how lucky we are to be on that place, that it's shaped the way it is, with the fields and the mountains and the flatlands, and that there are birds in the forest and there are fish in the waters. But more importantly, it tells us that we're connected to it through both that story of creation, but also through something we call whakapapa. And whakapapa is genealogy. It's the genealogy. And literally in our language, and it's been really interesting listening to your language over the last few days and the explanations of what the language is. To whakapapa is to lay flat. So when we're talking about our whakapapa, our genealogy, we're talking about the people that came before, but the relationships and the stories and the connections of all of that stuff that came before us. And we are a result of that. So within that initial whakapapa that I talked about, Te Waka Aoraki, that canoe of Aoraki that we all live in the South Island of New Zealand. Also within that, it tells a story that we're connected to that through whakapapa, through raki, down to who we are. So it's not just a convenience that we live on this canoe, this waka. We have a relationship, we are related to the place. We have a relationship with, and we are related to the birds and the fish of that place. We're the same thing. We share the same family. Now, like I said, that's a story that you guys know, that end part. I've heard that many times over the last 3 days. But it's a reframing of that story. But once again, it underlines the fact that we're connected to and related to. They are our brothers and sisters. They are our cousins. But that story of the waka, of the canoe, is the departure. That's a difference in this story. The second story I want to tell is a story of a waka called the Takitimu. And the Takitimu is a waka that came from eastern Polynesia, and it brought people. It brought the people that came to our land. Actually, first I'll tell the story of the Uruwal, who brought the first people in about 850. And sometimes when I've been telling people this, back home in New Zealand, we consider ourselves, our tribe, our iwi, to be the first people of the land there, because we got there about 850 AD. And we thought that's pretty old, eh? Until we come over here, and you fellas have been here for thousands of years. We're just kids. We're just the younger relations. We don't know anything. But when the Waka Uruwal arrived, and the first person arrived in our land from somewhere else on a canoe, on a waka, he started a fire. And we have a saying that we use. Ko rā kaiho tū te takata nana I tīmata te ahi kei rongi I tēnei motu. That rā kaiho tū was the first man to light fires on this land. And we look at that fire, that metaphorical fire, as that fire of occupation. That fire of occupation. And it is our duty as the descendants of that first person to keep those fires lit. And because it's a metaphorical fire, the way that we keep the fire lit is working together with the land and with all of the other elements of the land that's on there, the birds, the fish, the plant life. So we have that duty through being the people of that land to maintain that land, to maintain that space. That third story that I'll tell you is that story of the Takitimu. And that Takitimu was another waka, another canoe that came down from the North Island and brought some people, another iwi, another tribe of people down. And when this canoe came, it got beached on a coastline, not far from where we live, right down the very bottom, or as I'll convince you guys, some of you guys in the last few days, right at the very top of the world. Because, of course, you know the maps that are drawn. Someone balls them up right from the start. Actually, am I allowed to say balls up? That's a colloquial term. It's a New Zealand term. It's completely... There was a mistake made when the maps were written, because they put all the large land masses right at the top and the small ones at the bottom. But, of course, you know what happens with land. It's going to slip through the water as it does. So this is actually is it safe to say that this is the bottom of the world over here? In our stories, the old people tell us, we're at the top of the world. But of course, that's all about perspective, isn't it? About where you position yourself in the world, in the universe. So when this other waka got beached, the people that were on there that stayed with us for a while, they built relationships with our people down there, and we cared for them, and we looked after them. And this was about 1450. We cared for them and we looked after them, and we had relationships with them. And there were offspring from those relationships. A lot of those people headed back up north where they come from, and a lot of them stayed down with us in our place. So within that, there are stories of 3 canoes that inform our identity of who we are. And they inform our identity via this word that we call mana. Mana. And mana
is a really interesting word, because when we open the dictionaries, and once again reflecting on their conversations in the last 3 days, don't trust the dictionaries that the missionaries wrote. When we open those dictionaries, we see that this word mana gets translated as pride and respect and authority. Now, there's a big problem with that dictionary definition, because those ideas of pride, respect and authority, those things that you garner for yourself, that you work all through your life to build up for people to give to you, that idea of mana being that thing is a purely Western idea from our perspective. It's a purely Western idea. We don't do things to gather off people or off the environment. My mum told me, and it's got to be true because that's what my mum said. She said that mana is something that can only be given to people. So when those missionaries came over and they were trying to understand this concept of mana, and our people were pointing to the wise people, to those people that did the work, that were exalted by others, they said, this is the person with mana. The missionaries took that as, this is the person that has worked hard to gather this stuff, but it's actually the person that's worked hard to give to others. The mana. To enhance and uplift the integrity of other people and of the environment. And even that word mana itself is a really interesting word. Once again, reflecting on our conversations, it means coming from that place of purity. So from our perspective, a person with mana is that person that gives and uplifts other people. That person that gives and uplifts the environment. That person that gives and uplifts our relations, the birds, the fish, etc. So when I reflect on that story of Aoraki, from the canoe, the waka that came from the sky, from the atua, from the gods, we think about this term mana atua, the mana atua, and how we as people have to give or uplift the integrity of the gods. Now, once again, I do this here, gods, because when we look in that dictionary definition of atua, we see this word gods. And it's a really interesting little trick that the missionaries have played. And my apologies if there are any missionaries in the room. Missionaries from 1840, my apologies. But with that concept of gods, when we put that S on the end of that word God, we start tending to get into this idea of myths and legends. God on its own is written in the scriptures, in the Bibles. It's something more solid, more tangible from those teachings. Whereas from that Western perspective, myths and legends are made up fanciful stories. They're made up fanciful stories. So our job with that mana atua is to uplift and uphold the integrity of the atua, the naturally occurring phenomenon, which is a better way, I think, of describing that to our non-Indigenous relations. Sure, we can call them gods, but they're naturally occurring phenomenon that we have relationships with, that we're related to, that we're connected to. Just as we have to uphold and enhance the mana of our ancestors, our tupuna. That second story that I told, that concept of mana tupuna, the mana of the ancestors, is enshrined in that story. When people arrived in the canoes from other places, we remember those places that they came from, those islands in the Pacific that we arrived from. And whenever we talk to our people from the Pacific, we say to them, it's great to see you, relation, from those islands that our waka came from back in the day. And sometimes we call them lazy as well, because they got off on the hot, sunny islands. We went down to the cold ones. They call us crazy. But within that as well, that concept, and the third concept of mana, is that mana takata, that mana of people. Upholding and uplifting the mana of people. So in our teachings, when we reflect on the canoes that we're from, on those waka stories, those waka journeys, when we think about Aoraki and we're living on that land, we're constantly reminded as Indigenous people that we've got the responsibility of enhancing and uplifting the integrity of the naturally occurring phenomenon around us, of the land, of the birds, of the trees, of the rocks themselves. When we think about and recite those stories about the Rakai Hautu and lighting the fires, it reminds us that we're responsible for uplifting and basking in the mana of the tupuna, of the old people and those places that they came from. And when we talk about the story of the Takitimu and the relationships that are made, it reminds us that we're responsible for enhancing and uplifting the mana takata, the mana of people that we deal with. And that's all done and all told through that story of relations and relationships and connections. Now, when I was asked if I wanted to present a keynote, I was thinking, what can I talk about? And it's really hit home in the last 3 days, that sort of title that I thought. I live on a canoe, but I'm on the back of a turtle. I'm from a canoe, but I'm on the back of a turtle. A turtle that's surrounded by water, a turtle that has stories of creation associated with it, a turtle that every time, and even I look at that landscape, it reminds me of my obligations to the atua, to the naturally occurring phenomenon, and how lucky we are to be here. It reminds us of our obligations to the old people and the people and beings that we're related to. And it reminds me of my obligations to other people, and how, as an Indigenous person, it's our role to be giving. We can't take the mana of others. If we take the mana of people and gather it for ourselves, it actually shows what a person of little mana we are. We have to grow the mana of the others, of people, ancestors, those relations, of the naturally occurring phenomenon and the environment. And this hits home for me every time we go and harvest one of our traditional foods, the titi, the mutton bird. Now the mutton bird, the titi, the sooty shearwater, Puffinus griseus, depending on which bird you want, what book you want to read. He's a really fascinating bird insofar as he only nests on the islands that our family have access to. Through our colonial history and the way that things worked out, the settlers came in and brought and acquired, we'll be polite, they acquired a lot of land off our people. But some places they didn't acquire, and it's pretty much the only places in the whole of New Zealand, were those islands that our people would go to each harvesting season. Now, similar once again to what happened here, our people were hunter-gatherers, would walk through the landscape. We'd go up the rivers into the mountains. We'd live in the land and with the land. Cheers. Wouldn't we sing? That's closer. Yeah, that's good, because I could hear myself there, and it's really putting me off. It was like, oh, I know what these fellas have to put up with now. They have to listen to this. It's much better to speak when you don't have to listen to yourself. Actually, I feel a lot less serious as well. So these islands here have always been in the custody of our whānau. It's one of the places that we'd go to on our waka, on our canoes, down to these islands and harvest the birds. And the birds themselves, they would arrive at certain times of the year. They were migratory, just like us, exactly the same. They would arrive in the islands at certain times of the year. And the islands that we have are very, very special places. We own those islands. No one else is allowed to set foot on those islands. We self-regulate that place, that we only go there for 2 months of the year. The rest of the time we leave it alone because it has to breathe and live, and those trees have to be who they are. Those birds, those fish have to live in their space without us. So we only go there for 2 months of the year. And when we go, it's an 8-hour boat trip these days, or it takes half an hour on a helicopter, but the boat's always better. 8 hours to get down there through some of the roughest waters in the world. And as a young man, you always get seasick. You guys get seasick on boats? 8 hours through some of the roughest waters, you can imagine what that would be like. But when we'd go there, being within that place, for those 2 months of the year, we'd always go, as kids we were brought up going down there. There was no electricity, no running water, there are no roads, there's no internet, there's no cell phone connectivity even today. But growing up down in that place, we were completely removed from everyone else and just lived with our family. And each family would go to a different place on these islands. So not only do we know for an absolute fact that no one that shouldn't be there, well, we don't know for a fact, but we'll pretend to tell you that we do. We're pretty confident that no one else has ever been there. We know that those places that we go to are places that only our families have been. The family across the creek, they don't come across, even though we're related to them. So there's a real relationship between the people and the land down there. But there's exactly the same relationship with the birds. The titi, the mutton bird, the migratory, they travel all around the Pacific Rim in a 4-month migration pattern. They leave our islands, they go up South America, up past Alaska, Vancouver Island, Alaska, Siberia, northern Japan, and then back down to our islands. So they go away and leave the place, and they come back. And when they come, they're a really interesting bird because they actually burrow in the ground, in holes in the ground. So they lay their eggs in there, and we catch the fledglings, we catch the chicks. But where they burrow under the roots of the trees. And once again, these trees only exist in that place. The tupiri tree. He's got a long, shallow root system so the birds can get underneath. And he's also got a big canopy up the top. Because these birds, these titi being seabirds, they can't land on land. The only time they ever make landfall is when they get to the islands. So at night when they go out during the day and collect food for the fledglings. And they come out at night, but they have to crash into the canopy of the trees. They can't make landfall. And you're walking around and you hear this crash into the tree, and then this bird falls beside you, and he looks up, has a look around, and then wanders away and finds his burrow and finds his chick. Now these birds, they go to and it's been, our stories have always told us, but now there's scientific evidence that these birds go to the same hole every year. They go to the same place every year to lay their eggs. They can live up to 21 years old, and they can have I think they start laying at about 4. So when they lay their eggs, they go to the same hole. So when we have a relationship with that land, with that area, that bird has exactly the same relationship. To catch the birds, in the first half of the season, we have to crawl across the ground, spend all day, 6-8 hours on the ground, with our arm in the hole in the ground, trying to find these birds. And the holes are quite long. We devised a system of back in the day we used to use a fern, but a system of a hook on the end of a piece of wire, and you have to literally lie on the ground. You can imagine this is in the ground. Move our eyes around like this. And feel around for the bird. And when we feel them, try to get them out of the hole. And the holes sort of shoot off in all sorts of different directions, so we're never really quite sure where it's going to be. And when I say we're not, my grandfather was. He knew those holes. Going down to that place, as I said, with the family, we'd go down with the grandfather, with my mother, with my uncles and aunties, with cousins. At times, living in the village that we were in, there'd be 6 or 7 uncles and aunties. There'd be 23 cousins for 2 months of the year. Sounds perfect, doesn't it? Except for those of us who know how annoying our cousins are. It's like Christmas Day every year. But being down there and being in that place, being on that same space and knowing those holes, and those holes are centuries old. Those birds and their relations have been coming to those same holes for centuries, just as we have. And my paua, my grandfather, he's the one that taught me everything I needed to know about being on that place and about catching birds. And I remember as a young man, 6 or 7, walking around, this is where you learn your trade as a mutton birder. And that time of the year, he'd be feeling around in the holes and be pulling them out. And my first job was to take the birds from where he was catching them over to where the uncles were plucking them, taking the feathers off. So all day long, back and forward as a 7-year-old kid. Then, as part of that process, the next thing you learn is how to pluck the backs, because they're the easiest thing to do. Then pluck the whole bird, and by the time you sort of work your way through your apprenticeship, season after season, by the time you're about 13 or 14, the old fella will give you a hook and go, "Rightio, boy, catch a bird." And that's a wonderful, wonderful moment. But I remember him. I remember the old fella, the old paua, the grandfather, laying with his arm on the hole in the ground. And he'd say to me, "Look at this, boy, there's going to be a bird right here." You'd see him reach around and pull the bird out. He'd been going to that same place for so long, he knew the holes in the ground and the ways that they went. Now that's no mean feat, because the island changes and it shifts and it moves and it breathes. The island is alive. Now once again, when I say that to our non-Indigenous relations, they sort of give me that look as, "Oh yeah, some more mystical stuff from the beige boy in the corner." Not exactly brown, just sort of beige. We can talk about that another time. But with that, the island, those tupiri trees, because their root system is so shallow, if a big wind comes through, they'll go over. And the way that our island works is they go over in about 20-year cycles. They grow up together as a whānau, as a family, and they go down at the same time. And when they go down, you can't get to the holes. And then all the undergrowth starts growing up around them. It feeds the undergrowth, the ferns, the bunui, other plants. And then the small saplings come up. And then they get bigger. And then in 20 years, you've got another nice big clearing. And these things move around the island. I've witnessed them 3 times in my lifetime, just moving around. And the island breathes and it lives. It's a beautiful thing. So anyway, the old paua, the old grandfather, he knew these holes intimately. He knew where to go, which way they'd go. And he knew where the birds were. He had that relationship. He had that connection to that place. So growing up in that environment with our family, knowing, with that old man, knowing, telling us about the trees and our relationship with it, about the water, and where to get the paua, the abalone, where to get the sea urchins, the kina, all of those things. How to survive in that land, but how to love that place, and how to understand that we're a part of what that place is. But it also, as well as feeding that, and feeding, I didn't even talk about food yet, is it? And they're great to eat. And I'll tell you what, it's one of the most amazing things in the world, that first feed of the season. And as hunters and gatherers, those of us here that know that, when you get that first deer of the season, or that, the first harvest of the season. And I remember vividly cooking those birds, those first ones of the season, in the coal range. Of course, no electricity. You cook on a wood fire, coal range. And when they come out, their skin's so crisp. And they're a fatty, fatty bird. The fat is so sweet and the flesh is so tender. I literally can't, I'm struggling to even talk about it without bringing tears to my eyes. I'm glad I'm standing here. You can't see me crying. Oh, I'm not crying, no. I'm just thinking about puppies and stuff. But that connection, and you know that when you catch those birds with your own hand, and the whakapapa, that connection of those birds going back to the same hole for centuries, their families being linked to that place with our family, us looking after the environment so they can come back, and them feeding us. And there's nothing more special than lying on that ground, literally, with my face in the dirt, the same place that my grandfather had his face, with my arm in a hole in the ground and pulling food out. And knowing that only happens because of the relationship and the connections that we have with that place. Because we love that place, we know that place. It's us. And we are it. And that bird, he's us and we are it. And we're nothing without it. So that connection is real. And I've heard that connection over the last 3 days from people around these tables, telling exactly that same story, but about other living elements, about other relations of ours. I was lucky enough a few years ago to go to New Mexico and spent some time at the Institute of American Indian Arts. And in there, we got to meet these wonderful people from Barrow in Alaska. And I told the story about our birds, and she told exactly the same story about the bowhead whale. Their food up there is that bowhead whale. And she said, on the week that I was born, the family caught a whale. And that kept us in food for, So she had this beautiful connection with place and with food. Exactly the same story that I've told you now. But when we're talking about our bird, and I said, he flies up past your coastline, she said to me, oh, that'll be sort of, is that August, September? Yeah, it'll be about then he gets there. And she said, we've seen it. She said, we've seen a big flock of black birds arriving and sitting in the water and eating with the bowhead whale. And for me, that was an absolute stunning moment to think that our food, that food that we look after, that looks after us, was sitting in the water, sharing food and eating food with their food. And it just reminded me of, even though our island is a very, very small place, a very small part of a canoe, nature is bigger. Our other relations are bigger. Even though I think that we're important in the life of those birds for 2 months of the year, for the other 10 months, they've got their own lives to live. But it reminded us as well of how we're connected to other Indigenous people in other places. And that food is a major connector for those things. I'm lucky enough to be able to tell these stories to our colleagues, to our relations, our non-Indigenous relations where I'm from, and to try to get them to understand what it means for us when we talk about ideas of mana, that we're not here to gather off people and place and landscape. We're here to give to and enhance. And when I talk to them about those ideas of whakapapa, and that our relationships and our relations don't just finish at grandparents. A lot of our non-Indigenous relations, they don't know anyone beyond their grandparents. Those names, those places that they're from, their whakapapa, their connections. So for them to understand or try to get their head around the fact, and it is a fact, that we're related to the birds and the fish and the trees. And the way that they reframe our stories into myths and legends as a part of that major problem of them not being able to understand. And that initial story that I told you, I said part of that, and the sanitised Western version of that is that the sky father and the earth mother got married, and they had plenty of children, and one of those was Tāne Mohu to the forests. And of course the question comes, how can the sky and the earth get married? And how can they have babies? It doesn't make sense to them from that Western perspective. But I reframe that with them. And I say, get rid of that whole idea of the sky and the earth being married. We don't know if it was a marriage, or if it was a civil union or a drunken one-night stand. We don't know what it was. But there's an absolute fact that there is a relationship between the sky and the earth. We can see it every day when we look out this window and we see them lying together. There's a relationship. We know for an absolute fact that because of that relationship, and only because of that relationship, that trees exist. That's an absolute fact. If the Sky Father and the Earth Mother weren't here, then our relations, the trees, wouldn't be here. And actually, scientific methods tells us now that, if we ruin the world, or ruin the earth or the sky, that we ruin the environment. So they're slowly catching up. But with that as well, it's an absolute fact that if the trees weren't here and the elements of the earth as we know them, if there wasn't that relationship, that people wouldn't be here. So by reframing that story into something simpler that they understand, it shifts the focus away from myths and legends into a story about relationships and connectivity. Relationships and connectivity. When I tell our non-Indigenous relations, when I tell our non-Indigenous colleagues that there's a relationship between the sky and the earth that allows the environment to be here, there's a relationship between the trees and elements of the earth that allows people to be here. Therefore, just as with any other of our relations, with our parents, with our grandparents, with our children, we've got the obligation not to take off them. We've got the obligation, we're obligated to build them, to uplift them. But we've got a choice as well. Just as with our parents, we've got the choice to either respect or disrespect our parents. We know what happens when we disrespect our parents. So we've got that choice. We've got the choice to respect or disrespect our grandparents. We've got the choice to respect or disrespect our other relations, our environment. And just as the negative connotations or what may happen if we disrespect our parents, if we disrespect our environment, we get negative back. If we try and take the mana from our relations, then we show what kind of people we are. And by simplifying that sort of story for our non-Indigenous relations, by telling them our perspective on the world, the universe and everything, aligning up with their understandings. Nā te pō ko te ao. In the beginning of the world there was darkness and then there was light, and the light was good. They tell exactly the same story. Father, why have you forsaken me? It's the same story. However, their interpretation and their end point is different. It's been lost somewhere along the way. So when I'm talking to our non-Indigenous colleagues about building relationships, I say there's a crossover point where all of our stories make sense. Just as there's a crossover story between how the canoe and the turtle makes sense. But there are parts in that story that sit in the gaps, and we don't need to fully investigate what they are. I would never come here and say to you guys, what are you talking about, turtle? That doesn't make any sense to me. That's the space in the middle. That's the space in here. It makes perfect sense. It's part of the story. I don't need to be invading that or discrediting that. I just need to let it be what it is. The overlap is the relationships. Just to end, I remember when we first started the IKG this year, Gina, she mentioned something that made perfect sense to me. It reminded me of an old whakatauki, a saying. I've written this down because sometimes my memory doesn't work very well. But the end point is quite a well-used proverb that our non-Indigenous people use in New Zealand. And it goes a little something like this. It says, Huia te rito o te harakeke, kei he te kōmako e kō. Ki mai ki a hau, he aha te mea nui o te ao, mākui ki atu, he tagata, he tagata, he tagata. Now what that says is, if you pick the heart of the flax bush, then where will the bellbird sing? So I ask you the question, what is the most important thing in the world? And the answer is, it is people, it is people, it is people. Now that's fascinating, because our non-Indigenous relations from New Zealand, they look at that and they go, so people are the most important. No, you've missed the whole point of that. The most important thing is the heart of the flax bush. The most important thing is the bellbird. But we, and I've heard this said three times in the last 3 days, we've been put here with this relationship to look after those things. I think one of the stories that I heard is people were put on the earth last to care for, to look after. If you pluck the heart of the flax bush, the bird will have nowhere to sing. If you destroy the environment, the relations that we have, it's ultimately going to come back to us and impact upon us. We're part of the environment, not apart from the environment. And those stories of the waka of the canoe and those stories of the turtle are the same stories that talk about connections and relations. And those stories that I've heard over the last 3 days, that I'm very humbled to hear over the last 3 days, and kei te mihi ki a koutou moto, koutou whakawhiti koro moto koutou mātou raka, and I acknowledge all of the conversations and all of the knowledge that you've allowed me to share with over the last 3 days, and I'm very humbled to be standing here. So I think that'll just about do it from me. Kei te tūaki au kei raro I te maru o tōku whanauka, o tōku tūpuna, o tōku atua hoki. So I stand here under the guidance, under the mantle of my ancestors, of my gods, the atua. Very humbled, and nō reira, a tēnā koutou, a tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you all very much for allowing me to be here. Kia ora.
I was thinking that I might want to just remind those of you who were here on Friday, and so how might we give Ron a proper send-off without the claps? Woo! I did the claps.
Kia ora. Kia ora.
Okay, so as I was sitting and really thinking about your keynote, Ron, it was reminding me of the central purpose of this year's IKG, and really thinking about how we educate that heart, mind, body, and spirit. How do we feed our the center of who we are as people? And the more I thought about it, the more I thought about a teaching which actually really isn't my own, so I won't share it in its entirety, but it is something that has been really influential, and it's the teaching of the one dish with one spoon. And so in the context of this territory, it talks about originally as Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people, actually it started with Haudenosaunee people, but it's been extended to include Anishinaabe people and then all the newcomers to this region. And it talks about the idea that the land is a dish that we all share, and we have that one spoon to share from. And so if you think about that in the context of the entire world, our Mother the Earth is that dish we all share. And so in terms of how we're going to move forward as peoples, we need to think about this, the fact that the earth is our first medicine. Caleb earlier talked about food as being our first medicine, but the earth, beyond that food, the earth is our first medicine. So we need to keep those relationships in our hearts. We need to keep those relationships in our bodies, in our spirits, in our minds, so that we can move forward in good ways. And so that's something that really stood out for me as I listened to your keynote, Ron, but also throughout the course of these 3 days. And so I just want to say miigwech to everybody for coming out, and I want to call up Daniel to send us off in a good way.
Bonjour. Bonjour, Nindanawan Maganadog. I'd like to say miigwech to the Aboriginal Resource Center. I'm not sure the acronym when people say IF this or IC, you know what I mean? ARC, I'm like, you know what I mean? I'm like, well, yeah. Sorry for, but the Aboriginal, First Nations, Indigenous students for their hard work and Humber College. And yeah, like I say miigwech again on behalf of the communities here. And I just wanted to wish everyone a safe trip back home, that things back home are the way that you left them when you came here. And I'll just continue just naming a prayer in closing. And I'd like to say miigwech again. Oh, in case you're wondering, so many people looking at me like, wondering who I am. But I've been, like, last few days, I've been introducing myself, like, over and over and over again, and the same people are looking at me like, yeah. But my name is Daniel Secord, Sinanene, from Misogyny Credit First Nation. And so, very briefly, I'll try my best here. Oh, bonjour. Bonjour. Ninandanawan de Maganudog. Bonjour, Gishmantu, Manatuag. And may manan bagdan na nongong gijigat, dibigat. Say maminwa mi Jim and bagdana manda. Miigwech way wiwan. Seman bagdana gishmantu. Seman bagdana manatuag. Nijwaswe and on deg minwa and an outzat. Jimwechugi mijang gaja mingoing. Juan mishnang maba bematisjik. We not moatge gishmantu maba bematisjik. Minwa mushkok mikwe. We sneak mijim. Mishkikin. Ake minwa noden. Chimiigwech kjamna do, ogi mijang gigitsimnan, miigwech ke binu jimnan, wewene jimaji gwat. Chimiigwech kjamna do, ogi mijang kinegego. Winar muat ke juan mishnang, kishmentu maba eskinejik, minuma equamagic. Wewene. Chimiigwech kjamna do, ogi mijang minwa bish. No, mikwendam. Miigwech. They say thank you everyone for listening, and I hope that everyone has a safe journey back to their homes, and we appreciate this time that we had together. We say miigwech. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just asking that everybody cleans up. So